love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff.
Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then.
I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will.
In 1815, the Reverend Patrick Bronte, an Irish author, moved to the village of Thornton in Yorkshire County with his wife Maria Branwell and their 2 daughters. Situated in the heart of the Bradford district, it was in this house that 4 more children were born into destinies as great as they were tragic. Charlotte, the eldest, would write 4 novels, the now classic Jane Eyre, Shirley, a story set during the industrial unrest of the Luddite Rebellion, Villette, a forgotten masterpiece of romance set in Belgium, and finally, The Professor, actually her first manuscript, which was published posthumously. Charlotte died in 1855 at the age of 38, just months after being married. Emily published only 1 novel, Wuthering Heights, a dark and tortured romance of violence and passion. Highly contested by the critics due to its controversial content, the book was released a year before her death in 1848. She was only 30 years old. Anne, the youngest, depicted her experience as a governess in Agnes Grey, before writing an epistolary novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, in which the main character tries to rebuild herself after her husband's moral decay. She died at the age of 29 near the cliffs of Scarborough, where she is buried. And finally, there is Branwell, the ever-elusive brother Branwell, sometimes poet or painter, whom with great care went so far as to erase himself from the family portrait that he himself had painted, leaving only his ghostly shadow overlooking the 3 sisters. He would be the first of the siblings to die of tuberculosis at the age of only 28. In 1820, the Bronte family moved a few miles to the village of Haworth, where Patrick had been appointed vicar of St. Michael's Church. They moved into the presbytery at the top of the village, which had an amazing view of the town and the surrounding heath. A year later, Maria Branwell dies. Elizabeth Branwell, Maria's sister, moves into the presbytery in order to look after her nieces and nephew. Then, in 1825, the 2 eldest daughters of the family, Maria and Elizabeth, both die at the age of only 10 and 11 years old. These tragedies will profoundly mark all of the remaining members of the family, in their lives but also in their works. The cemetery located between their home and the village church serves as a constant reminder of the omnipresence of death in the Bronte's stories. Patrick, for his part, faced this series of personal tragedies by instilling in his children a love for the arts whilst doing his best to stimulate and enlighten them both intellectually and spiritually, helping them to transcend their pain and grief by encouraging their creativity. He had great hopes to see Branwell, his only son, become a distinguished painter or an eminent poet. Alas, vain hope. Branwell would go on to lose himself into a life of debauchery. It is elsewhere that the work of the Reverend will bear its fruits. His 3 remaining daughters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, will go on to write a significant chapter of English literature.
Charlotte was actually the 3rd child in the Bronte family. She had 2 elder sisters who very tragically died when they were all sent away to Cowan Bridge School. But that left her as the oldest child in the family, but with her brother Branwell coming up so very close behind, just a year younger, and then a year younger than that, Emily, and then 2 years younger, the baby of the family, Anne.
So little is known about Emily, among her sisters. She is the most private, I think, of the Bronte sisters, and therefore quite mysterious, quite a solitary figure in many ways. But that belies the fact that she was very much a part of her family, very important in the family, and Charlotte, for example, was absolutely devoted to her.
Anne Bronte was the youngest child. The elder siblings were rather dismissive towards her, and particularly Branwell. So she clearly had a pretty tough childhood with two very dominant older siblings. She was very close to Emily, and like Emily, had a very strong love of animals and of nature.
One day in June of 1826, Patrick came home from Bradford with a present that would spark his children's imaginations and creativity: a box of little wooden soldiers. Each one was given a name and a history and used by the siblings as characters of an imaginary world called Glasstown. They created all sorts of elements linked to this new universe: songs, poems, paintings and stories. They wrote in tiny letters on little pieces of paper to create books no larger than a matchbox. Their heroes were inspired by personalities such as Lord Byron, Napoleon, or even the Duke of Wellington, and their political intrigues took place in the imaginary colonies of Africa or the Pacific. The more the Brontes published their works, the more defined their literary talents became. Emily had strong tastes for poetry and romanticism, while Charlotte showed an interest in social issues and the destinies of her characters.
Branwell and Charlotte had started working on their early writing, sometimes called the juvenilia, wonderfully inventive tales that they modelled on a lot of their reading. They create a land in Africa where they send their heroes who build this colonial power with its own mills, its industry, constantly fighting the Ashanti, though it's not very African-based, because they actually then start to build a form of Yorkshire out there in Africa.
Victorian Yorkshire is absolutely full of ghost stories and authentic, proper folklore dating back, in some cases, hundreds of years. In part because Yorkshire is undergoing lots of changes itself. It's changing from being a very rural area to being a very industrial area. They were very close to Pendle, the Pendle district, which is where one of England's largest witch trials took place. Pendle's in Lancashire, but housed very close to the Lancashire border. And I think the Brontes might have known Harrison Ainsworth's novel about those witch trials, which made them famous all over again, and which portrays the witches in quite a sympathetic light.
In some of the early writings, Charlotte and Branwell produced their own copies of Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, which is a periodical that they'd really loved. It had all sorts of materials. It had politics, it had fiction, poetry, editorials. Charlotte and Branwell trying to mimic these.
And they probably also found it exciting to incorporate supernatural stories into their own kind of fantasy worlds. And they wove together in their own writings those kind of Gothic stories that they read in print and the folk tales that their servants told them. And that, I think, is what gives their work its extraordinary edge and quality of daring that other Victorian Gothic doesn't really have.
They're constantly drawing on romantic tales, but also the materials of what they find around them every day in Haworth, which, despite what people think, was not a tiny little village. It had many mills and factories, and the parsonage was just at the top of the main street, and so they were very linked into the community.
In 1831, the two younger sisters, Anne and Emily, succeeded from Glasstown and created their own alternative world called Gondal. Charlotte and Branwell continued administrating their universe, now under the name of Angria.
We know much less about that world of Gondal than we do about Angria. There's just less of that material that's come down to us that was preserved. With Emily and Anne's vision of Gondal, their most powerful figure is the woman. For the first time, they've taken a long journey together, and they went, the two of them, by train to York. The whole time they were on the train journey, they were taking the various characters, and she names them all, of characters from Gondal. They lived their fantasy world the whole train journey while dealing with all the practicalities of a journey and life and enjoying that. And I think that says something about Emily. She was able to inhabit these worlds, and there was not really a demarcation for her between that fantasy world and everyday life.
Charlotte and Emily went to school in Roe Head. Emily quickly became depressed and returned home to live at the presbytery, where she invested herself more in the household chores while getting on with her education. Anne took Emily's place at the school, and Charlotte soon became a teacher there. As time went on, Branwell went from bad to worse and failed in all of his attempts to break into the cultural and artistic world. Charlotte sent a few of her poems to the eminent poet Robert Southey in order to get his opinion on her work. He replied that literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be. The three sisters worked alternatively as governesses and teachers in several families and schools. However, they usually didn't keep these positions for long. Anne worked the longest in the service to the Robinson family at Thorpe Green Hall near York. Determined to become independent, they decided to open a school for young women, and in order to realize this project, they needed to complement their own educations, especially in French. For that reason, they enrolled at the AJ boarding school in Brussels in 1842.
Monsieur Eyre, who was the husband of the woman who ran the school, he took a great interest in we still have their essays that they wrote for him. But it's quite clear that Charlotte conceived quite a grand passion for him. Their aunt died, they both had to come back to Haworth, and then Charlotte returned alone, and I assume that it was at this point that the passion grew. We were unclear about the extent of it until last century when letters were discovered, which I think had been suppressed earlier, which show how strongly she felt, which she sent them to him, and his wife apparently discovered them in the waste paper basket and put them together again, so we are indebted to her. But a sense of absolute yearning, love, how could he not reply that her whole life was being destroyed? And you get this sense then, I think, coming through in a lot of her writing.
The three Bronte sisters eventually reunited when Charlotte returned home from Belgium. They printed out leaflets advertising the opening of their new school, but as no one enrolled, they were obliged to abandon the project. One day, Charlotte discovered Emily's poems.
Charlotte was electrified by these poems and said, I'd never read anything like these before, especially from the pen of a woman. Emily was furious. It took quite some persuasion for Charlotte to convince her sister that these poems should be published. And the intercession of the so-called peacemaker of the family, Anne, by showing her own poems as well to Charlotte, sort of interceded and led the way to convincing Emily that indeed these should see the light of day, they should be publicly known.
Charlotte didn't include Branwell at this point because he'd gone off the rails, to put it very politely and mildly. He was the great hope of the family, the one in whom the money was invested to ensure that he could make a career. But in fact, as we know, he drunk himself stupid, he took drugs. He was very dissolute at this point.
Poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell was published by Aylott and Jones in 1846. They decided to use male pen names and self-funded the printing. Charlotte became Currer Bell, Emily Ellis Bell, and Anne Acton Bell. The book was not a great success, regardless of the quality of some of the work, especially Emily's, and only 2 copies were sold. Nevertheless, this collection of poetry contains the core and the essence of their work.
The poetry of Gondal is, I think, much more linked to a romanticism and also a lyric subjectivity, a turning into the self. It's about love, it's about passion, it's about grief about death. One of her poems, Remembrance, and it begins, cold in the earth and
the deep snow piled above thee, far, far removed, cold in the dreary grave. Have I forgot my only love to love thee, severed at last by time's all-severing wave? Now, when alone, do my thoughts no longer hover over the mountain on that northern shore, resting their wings where heath and fern leaves cover thy noble heart forever, evermore? Cold in the earth, and 15 wild Decembers from those brown hills have melted into spring. Faithful indeed is the spirit that remembers after such years of change and suffering. Sweet love of youth, forgive if I forget thee, while the world's tide is bearing me along. Other desires and hopes beset me, hopes which obscure, but cannot do thee wrong.
It ends with that question mark, and the rest of the poem goes on to say, no, I have not forgotten my love. It's been 15 years and I have not forgotten this love, but I also in some ways have to realise that it's buried. And he or she says to the lover, please forgive me, but life is dreary without you, but I have to go on. I have to be part of this world.
1847 was the Bronte sisters' big year. They worked in secret. Patrick had no idea that the Juvenilia era was over and that his daughters were all starting their first novels. They ambitiously planned to publish them all together. The Professor, Charlotte's first novel, was completed in June of 1846. The manuscript was refused by the editors and only published after her death. It contains, nevertheless, the essential themes at the core of Charlotte's work and was mainly inspired by her time in Brussels. It is the story of William Crimsworth, who moves to Belgium to teach after having refused to become a member of the clergy. While teaching at a school for girls, he falls in love with a student, Frances.
Charlotte Bronte wrote The Professor first of all her novels, but she returned to the themes in Villette because they both feature a protagonist. In Professor it's male, in Villette it's female, who has no other means of support, goes to Brussels to try and make a living teaching English. And in both of them you get the interaction in the school, and both of the characters finally make it and start to run their own schools. Some very interesting material in The Professor, particularly the rivalry between the hero, William Crimsworth, and his brother, who they hate each other, basically. But also another figure, Hunsdon, who is almost a sort of not quite in a sexual relationship with William, but there's such a sense of charge between them. And Hunsdon is a very sort of peculiar figure. And so you get these forms of disruption throughout The Professor that turn it into a very interesting novel, I think, and rather far removed from what you might think an account of a schoolmaster setting up his own school might actually be.
Published at the same time as Wuthering Heights, Anne's first novel, Agnes Grey, is based on her own experiences as a governess for the Ingham family. The children she looked after were wild and misbehaved, and she could not educate them the way she wanted. In her novel, the young governess Agnes Grey quickly discovers how, in some families, values and principles can be completely lost. The main character descriptions and the attention to detail make this book an amazing testimony of the life of a governess, concentrating, however, more on her turmoils than her joy.
Agnes Grey was published, first of all, in a 3-volume edition with Wuthering Heights. The publisher of Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights, who was rather an unscrupulous man, had it put around that the 3 Bell writers were all the same person. Anne went with Charlotte to London to see George Smith, who was the publisher of Jane Eyre, to show that they were not in fact the same person. 2 women from Yorkshire in black dresses, and their only means of identification was the fact that they had some correspondence that showed that Charlotte was in fact Clara Bell. She clearly has very particular views about education and the correct forms of education, and quite radical views about education. So her novels are some of the most important expressions, I think, in literary form or in fictional form about the terrible conditions that governesses have to go into in order to make a living. So her account of how dreadful it is to be a governess and how powerless a woman is in that situation.
During her long walks in Haworth's surrounding heath, Emily worked on her one and only novel, Wuthering Heights. On a hill a few kilometers outside of Haworth is Top Withens, an old Elizabethan farmhouse that dominates the surrounding countryside. It is difficult to stand there and not to think of Heathcliff's home, especially when the winds are blowing across the heath. Another exceptional location that Emily spent countless hours at was Kundin Kirk, a gigantic stone protruding from a cliffside, seemingly unaffected by time. Emily calls it Penistone Crags in the novel. Lower down on the heath is Kundin Hall, a large mansion reminiscent of Thrushcross Grange that can be seen whilst heading down the road towards the village. However, given the curved features of the mansion's architecture mentioned in the novel, the Linton abode seems to have been inspired more by Shibden Hall near Halifax. Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Heathcliff, Catherine Linton.
Let me in!
Who are you? It all started in this hostile land at the top of a hill called Wuthering Heights. The owner, Mr. Earnshaw, came back from Liverpool with a young orphan he renamed Heathcliff. His family has mixed feelings regarding the arrival of the boy in their home. From the very first day, Earnshaw's son Hindley truly hated this intruder, while his sister Catherine, who had a wild and passionate temper like Heathcliff's, falls madly in love with him, and the 2 children become inseparable, spending all of their time together, running through the heath far from Hindley. When Mr. Earnshaw passes away, Hindley inherits the estate, and Heathcliff, now deprived of his benefactor, has no protection from the bitterness of Hindley's hard feelings towards him. Now teenagers, Heathcliff and Cathy have an encounter that will change the course of their lives. At the foot of Wuthering Heights, there was a beautiful mansion called Thrushcross Grange. Heathcliff and Cathy decide to spy on the people living there, but they are chased away and Cathy is bitten by a dog.
Heathcliff, run!
She stays there for several weeks, convalescing, during which time she meets Edgar Linton. Meanwhile, at Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff's situation is more and more desperate, and he can no longer stand being so far from his beloved. Back at the Wuthering Heights, Cathy seems to have become a different person. One evening, Heathcliff overhears a conversation between Nellie and his loved one, saying that it would be humiliating for her to marry him.
It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now.
Deeply hurt by this comment regarding his origins, the young man leaves the estate. When Cathy realizes that he is gone, she is devastated.
Heathcliff! Heathcliff! Heathcliff!
When he returns to Wuthering Heights years later, Heathcliff is a changed man. Now, a perfect gentleman who seems to have been very successful financially. He soon learns that Cathy has married his rival, the wealthy Edgar Linton, and that she now lives at Thrushcross Grange. Heathcliff takes control of Wuthering Heights soon afterwards. Cathy dies, giving birth to a little girl, also named Catherine. An inconsolable Heathcliff will not find peace until he has had his revenge.
If you look at Wuthering Heights, we all know Heathcliff and Catherine have that, they are iconic romantic lovers. And yet the whole novel is couched within a world of quite intense realism as well. When you look at the different houses, when you look at the life, the everyday life of Wuthering Heights, you sort of know when people are having their meals, you know what the room looks like, people passing in and out over the thresholds, the sort of farming life that's going on around.
Catherine famously says that her love for Heathcliff is like the rocks beneath, it will be eternal. But she says, he is me and I am him. We are the same person. So we have this extraordinary, not even unity, or not even affinity, but sameness between the white heroine and the non-white hero. That's remarkable.
They live with a passion that is extremely powerful, but also would tend to bring down those elements which thread society together. This is a subversive passion, and Lockwood is a very poor reader of that kind of passion. So there's this moment when Lockwood first meets the young Cathy, and as he's going in the door, he sees what he thinks are young kittens playing there, and he says to Cathy, I see you've got some of your young favourites here, something like that. And Cathy kind of sneers derisively at him because she says, well, those would be strange favourites because they're dead rabbits. And this is something that Lockwood just can't understand. He's somebody who's come from the city. He can't read the society that he's in.
One story that I think Emily probably did know it's really a whole set of stories about the fact that people who died before their time were the most likely people to become ghosts. The girl would die first without getting to have sex with the man she loved, and she would then haunt the man she loved, and he would sometimes be tempted to kiss her or to have sex with her, but if he did, she would turn into this sort of sex vampire and would drain him completely dry, and he would actually be found dead the next morning. Cathy, she's never had sex with Heathcliff, she's never had sex with the man she loves. And that, I think, is what she's doing out there wandering on the moor. I don't think it's attraction to the moor. I think she's looking for something. The other kind of factor in the story is the irony factor, that Heathcliff is actually very much wishing to fulfill dead Cathy's wishes for necrophiliac sex. It's his fantasy too. It's almost as if his fantasy is coming from the ghost, is coming to him out of the ghost's desires. But ultimately, neither of them can achieve it. It's like they miss each other in the dark. And so the only way that Heathcliff can enact that fantasy is the demand that he and Cathy be buried together and that their coffins be kind of knocked apart so their bodies can reach out to one another. And that's a very ballad theme too. When that happens, typically one kind of vine will grow out of the man's grave and another out of the woman's grave, and the two vines twine together in a kind of sexual act that wasn't available to the people in life.
When Wuthering Heights was first published, it was very harshly reviewed. Emily was somebody who had a great deal of will and resolution and sort of independence of mind, and Charlotte says that at first they just laughed about these reviews, but of course they were extremely harsh. One critic said that it was coarse and savage, sort of thoroughly savage, loathsome, the kind of thing the kind of savagery that just should not be seen in any work of art.
It won't take Charlotte long to bounce back following the professor's failure. Jane Eyre comes out in October of 1847 and propels the Bronte sisters, or the Bells, to the top of the literary scene. In the story, an orphan, Jane Eyre, is sent by her aunt to Lowood boarding school, where she suffers 10 long years of humiliation and deprivation. Afterwards, she finds a position as governess of Thornfield, the home of Mr. Rochester. A love story begins between these two protagonists, but they are forced to confront social conventions and the secrets of Thornfield Mansion. The Cowan Bridge boarding school, where Charlotte's two elder sisters had died of typhoid fever, was only a few kilometers away from Haworth, and Charlotte spent enough time in this institution to depict it as the Lowood boarding school. As for Thornfield, it is very similar to East Riddleston Hall, a splendid 17th century manor house in Keighley, West Yorkshire.
Jane is forever challenging, as she did when she was at home with her aunt. She challenges the Reverend Brocklehurst, who runs the school, and is forever asking why they should be treated in this way. She believes that a child has a right to speak out and to express their anger and their passion. And I think in Jane Eyre you get the first real representation of a child who believes that there should be justice for children. And I think this is what makes Jane Eyre so special. It was the first time that anybody had really created such a passionate, articulate child who was determined to challenge adults' rights to control children. This same passion and sense of self-worth and rights comes out later in Jane's life when Mr. Rochester proposes to her, first of all, a marriage, which she's very unsure about because she is his social inferior. But then when she discovers he's already married, she in a very moral way leaves him and tries to find herself again.
One of the most beautiful scenes in the novel is, of course, when Rochester proposes to Jane, and it's a wildly passionate but also achingly romantic scene that takes place in an English garden. But at the critical moment of that scene, a giant, colourful moth flies into Rochester's view, and he's distracted by it, and he says to Jane, "It looks like a moth or an insect from the West Indies." And so what we have there, this very, very subtle moment in an English country garden, in this great romantic moment, the West Indies, colonisation, slavery, infiltrating, penetrating that scene. And I think it's really rather extraordinary how that scene is orchestrated in such a subtle way, and it indicates the way in which Charlotte has a global sensibility, an idea that this domestic romance is happening in an enormous political, tumultuous political scene too. It's a novel that frames lots of questions and poses the difficulties of being a particular kind of woman in a particular historical moment. So one of the most curious things about Jane Eyre, the novel, is that the action of the novel takes place in around, we think, the 1820s, 1830s period. And that's an extraordinarily important moment, particularly in British history, mainly for one thing, which is the slave trade. The Slave Trade Act is passed in the UK in 1807, and the abolition of slavery happens in 1833. So these enormous things are happening. This novel is absolutely embedded in that political history. So Jane herself often refers to herself as a slave. Rochester talks about governessing as a kind of slavery. The idea of slavery, the political activity of abolition, is part of the allegory of Jane's position as a subjugated woman in the 1830s.
Charlotte was raised as a clergyman's daughter, and that comes over very clearly in her novels. They're absolutely suffused with religious imagery. All the time you get little quotations from the Bible. But quite interestingly, what Charlotte does with many of these quotations is use them almost to challenge the ways in which they've been read. She takes the words of Christ on the cross and uses these herself as if she almost feels that she's impersonating God. There are other aspects where she seems almost a bit blasphemous. I'm quite sure she never thought of herself as such, but in her creativity, what she's doing is drawing upon the language of the Bible and challenging the ways in which it's been interpreted by a male society. There is also a very strong moral element within her novels, but not as Victorian society would recognise it. She scandalised people by the ways in which she represented sexual passion. Jane Eyre is very, very strongly sexualised in her desires. She represents a potential bigamous marriage. And so in many ways she was absolutely violating everything that a decorous and moral Victorian woman should think or say. When Jane comes out, it is greeted extraordinarily with almost adulation. This is an unknown author, but almost immediately reviews are coming out saying this is real, this is a new way of looking at life and of the 19th century characters. Jane Eyre made Charlotte Bronte into an instantly famous author. When her sex was revealed, there was a lot of critical reviews suggesting that a woman should never have written in this way.
Anne broke new ground with The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. She found most of her inspiration in her own experience as a governess to depict a certain view of the society at the time. Helen Graham, a young widow, arrives in a village with her young son. In spite of the curiosity and gossip that she creates, she quickly develops a friendship with one of the inhabitants, Gilbert Markham. In order to help Helen, Markham decides to discover the truth about her past and soon finds out that she is married to the violent and alcoholic Arthur Huntington. Wanting to protect her son, she escaped from a life of misery by pretending to be a widow.
The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was her second novel, and in its themes, it's very similar to Wuthering Heights, although it's a very different treatment of those particular themes. It seems to be about education and about marriage and about the condition of women. Much of the novel is about Helen's desire to protect her child from his father and from the corrupting influence of his father and his father's circle. And a lot of the novel is directed towards alcohol and alcoholism. It's very likely that much of the novel is based on the experiences that Anne had when she was the governess to the Robinson family. And in many ways, Arthur Huntington seems to be modelled on Branwell and his wild lifestyle. While she was a governess, she'd encountered things happening within that household that she was very shocked by and quite traumatised by. She wrote in the back of the prayer book in very small writing that she was sick of mankind and his disgusting ways. So clearly that she was had been very affected by whatever that she'd witnessed in that household. When it was reviewed, it was felt to be a very shocking novel, and in fact Charlotte thought that Anne should never have written it and wanted to excuse it in some way. The critics complained about the very frank accounts of adultery. I mean, for our eyes, for a reader in the 21st century, it doesn't seem particularly frank, but I think for a reader in the middle of the 19th century, that these forms of behaviour were discussed in a very frank way that people thought was quite shocking, particularly for a young, unmarried woman writer to be writing about these topics.
Charlotte's novel, Shirley, takes place during the uprising of 19th century English textile artisans, the Luddites. Their jobs being threatened by the arrival of the first mechanical looms, they decide to destroy the machines and organize a rebellion against the factory owners. A young heiress, Shirley Keldar, moves to town hoping to help Robert Moore, one of the manufacturers, as well as the poor workers. There are several connections between Charlotte's Bradford social circle and the novel. For instance, Mary Taylor's home, the Red House, a Tudor-like mansion, served as the model for Briarmaids. Ellen Nursey, one of Charlotte's oldest friends, introduced her to Oakwell Hall, a place she describes in the book as Fieldhead.
In her novel Shirley, although it's set back at the early part of the century with Luddite rebellions, she's clearly paralleling the life of one of the heroines, Caroline Helston, who leads a very imprisoned life, with that of the workers who are revolting against the introduction of machinery. So there's the sense that both of them are being oppressed by the society in which they live. Shirley makes a very interesting contrast to her friend Elizabeth Gaskell's novels, both Mary Barton and North and South, because in those it's quite clear that Elizabeth Gaskell is taking the side of the workers, and Mary Barton, for example, really focuses virtually entirely on the workers and their sense of injustice and their suffering. Whereas in Shirley, Charlotte Bronte is very even-handed. We focus on the middle class, and so we see the workers often through their eyes, and very little in their actual lives at all, so that they are figures who are there in the background creating this turmoil. There's a wonderful scene where the workers attack the mills, and the two heroines, Caroline and Shirley, are sitting up on the hillside. They've been excluded. And they're both sympathising with the men who are defending the mills, but also, it seems, with the workers as well. And so Charlotte Bronte is not coming down on either side, except that she makes the novel, the structure of it means that she is paralleling the role of the women, particularly Caroline, who's unable to get married because the mills cannot turn because of the political rebellions, and that of the workers. And so it's only when the external war has finished that the mill owner can marry Caroline. It's a strong sense that it's looking at the role of women in relation to the problems of political upheaval.
As in The Professor, her first novel, the intrigue of Charlotte's Villette is largely inspired by her relationship with the great love of her life, Constantin Heger, her teacher and later colleague in Brussels. Lucy Snow, the main character, arrives in Villette, the capital of the Kingdom of La Basse-Cour, to teach English in a school for girls. She witnesses and becomes embroiled in numerous intrigues involving blooming young women, a very nosy principal, a charming doctor, and even the ghost of a nun. She depicts in fine detail the psychological portraits of these characters before describing her own part of the story with the truculent Monsieur Paul, another teacher.
With Villette, she, as she says, purposely made her heroine a cold character, and she called her, first of all she called her Lucy Frost, then she changed it to Lucy Snow. So in her novels you do get the sense of love of a master. It's not closely based on Charlotte Bronte's own life, but you do get the orphan Lucy Snow, who decides she will go and try and make her fortune in Belgium, lands in Brussels, finds herself a role teaching English in the school, and is courted by the fiery Monsieur Paul, who is clearly modelled to some degree on Monsieur Eyre, but in this case rewards Lucy by falling in love with her. Lucy Snow idolises the Dr. John, who in fact he's Dr. John Graham, and he's based upon the name of her father's medical book, which is by Thomas John Graham, Modern Domestic Medicine. You find in these texts an absolute obsession with the female reproductive system, with menstruation. We tend to think that women in the Victorian age would never have talked about these things with their doctors. On the contrary, the medical companions say that you must always go to your doctor, whether your flow is too thick, too thin. They invented about 10 different forms of disease that you could have associated with the reproductive system. They also, in discussions of insanity, believed that there were about 20 different forms of insanity that women could suffer that were all linked in one way or another to their reproductive system. One that I think Charlotte Bronte probably draws upon is erotomania, which was the idea of being obsessed by a loved one, but chastely. And I think you can see that in Villette. Charlotte Bronte describes Lucy as being a monomaniac, and a lot of what she does is obsess about Dr. John. And I think Bronte is following quite closely there some of the ideas about female Victorian psychology, but again she's breaking through them because she's not making Lucy a passive sufferer. She suffers, but she challenges, and she demands her right to have these feelings rather than simply be classified as someone who is mentally ill.
In the span of 2 years, between 1848 and 1849, Branwell, Emily, and Anne died of tuberculosis. Emily, inconsolable after her brother's death, became ill the day of his funeral and passed away a few months later. Anne thought she could cure herself by breathing the fresh air of Scarborough. In vain. She never returned, and is buried there a few 100 kilometers away from the Bronte crypt in Haworth, where the rest of the family lay. This distance contributes to the theory of the other Bronte sister. However, Charlotte's poem about Anne's death is a reminder to us of just how much she was loved and cherished.
There's little joy in life for me, and little terror in the grave. I've lived the parting hour to see of one I would have died to save. Calmly to watch the failing breath, wishing each sigh might be the last, longing to see the shade of death o'er those beloved features cast. The cloud, the stillness that must part, the darling of my life from me. And then to thank God from my heart, to thank him well and fervently. Although I knew that we had lost the hope and glory of our life, and now, benighted, tempest-tossed, must bear alone the weary strife.
Charlotte died in March of 1855, aged 38, a few months after her marriage to her father's assistant. Ironically, his name was Arthur Bell Nichols, Bell being the common pseudonym of the three sisters. Shortly afterwards, Patrick asked Elizabeth Gaskell to write a biography, which remains to this day one of the main sources of information about the family. Patrick outlived his wife and his 6 children. He finished his days in the presbytery in Haworth, where he died in 1861. Arthur Bell Nichols, Charlotte's husband, stayed by his side up until the end. Behind the presbytery, a small path runs along a wall and leads down to the heath. In the distance, you can just hear the rustling of a waterfall, mixed with gusts of wind stroking the tall grass. A small stone bridge takes you across the stream. Further on, the view, which has been obstructed up until now, suddenly opens up into endless fields of heather. As far as the eye can see, a wild landscape intertwines with hills and shrubs in constant battle with the never-ceasing wind, seemingly eternal and full of stories. It is here where Emily Bronte's verses come to life.
The night is darkening round me, the wild winds coldly blow, but a tyrant spell has bound me, and I cannot go. But a tyrant spell has bound me, and I cannot go. The giant trees are bending, their bare boughs weighted with snow, and the storm is fast descending, and yet I cannot go. And the storm is fast descending, and yet I cannot go. Clara